In this video, we're going to update the weather app for iOS 15 and fix some issues we had before. Now, this is a pretty basic app, so the only new iOS 15 thing we're going to explore is the new SF symbol stuff, but I want to clear up an issue with binding that I originally did on this app that will maybe clear things up, and then we'll talk about some deprecated syntax that usually happens when a new iOS version comes out. Okay, so here I am right where the project left off. So hopefully you're in a similar version than I am. But the first thing I always do anytime a new iOS comes out is you click on the project here, right? And then now you want to target, if you click on project, iOS deployment target iOS 15. Now again, this makes your minimum target iOS 15. Like I said in the iOS 15 update overview, very, very few apps can actually do this. Usually they have to support iOS 14, maybe even 13. But again, for checking things, I go to iOS 15 because then I'll get all the errors if I'm using stuff that doesn't work. And again, this is a super beginner teaching app, so we're not worried about supporting older iOS versions. The whole point of this is to show you the new stuff in iOS 15. So now that I am supporting iOS 15, I do a Command B to do a build, and doing that will show me any errors or warnings that I have. You can see I have 2 errors up here. Let me go to iOS 13 Pro here. Maybe that's the issue here. I'm not sure what errors I have. Yeah, those errors were because I was not on an iPhone and it didn't quite get it. So make sure you have the iPhone 13 in your simulator to clear that up. Okay, so into the content view, the first thing I want to talk about is deprecated syntax, because like I said, this happens every iOS update. Usually you'll get a warning for them if they're being close to actually not working anymore. But what's deprecated, and actually we'll go down here, this was actually deprecated in iOS 14 and I missed it. And that's another lesson is you're not going to catch all the deprecations right away. Well, let me back up because this is a beginner course. What does deprecating even mean? Well, Apple will change the language of Swift or SwiftUI, and they'll try to constantly improve it. So sometimes they'll change the syntax of old language and just change the way you do things. The good thing here is when they're deprecating something, they'll usually give you a couple years warning. So for example, this Edge is ignoring safe area still works great. You don't even see any warnings. That's what I'm saying. So that just happened last year. So probably in a year or two, you'll start to see warnings. And then maybe another year after that, then they'll finally break your code. So don't worry about deprecations too much. It's great to stay on top of them and not wait for it to break your code. But like I said, Apple does give you plenty of warning. And we can see that if we option click on ignore safe area and go into open developer documentation, you can see on the right, deprecated. Now you may be wondering well, how do I know if it's deprecated? A lot of times you got to look in the Xcode release notes. In the iOS developer world, after WWDC in June, so from June to September, Xcode betas are coming out. Everybody's looking at the documentation. You're seeing all the new deprecations. A lot of people are talking about them on Twitter. So unfortunately, at least not that I know of, there's no centrally located list you can go look at. I guess keeping up with the Xcode beta release notes will show you. But like I said, try to keep up with them that way. But if you miss 1 or 2, it's not a huge deal. And then again, in probably a year or so, you will get the warning that tells you this has been deprecated, check out the new thing. So the new thing is ignore safe area. And like I said, this was deprecated in iOS 14. So I missed this one. But again, no big deal if you miss it, come back and fix it. So that's just the big picture lessons on deprecations. And with SwiftUI, because it's so new, it's so young, you're going to see a lot of changes early on. Over time, as it matures, that will slowly happen less and less. But again, we are in the beginning, so you kind of got to expect that to happen. Now, the next thing I want to point out, since we are in our background view, let me refresh your memory. We refactored out this background view, which again is this black and gray here gradient. For example, I'm going to go to isNight equals false to go back to the blue. And there we go. I like that look better. So we have isNight is false. Now you see this background view, which is what I was talking about. We passed in isNight. Now, if you're doing this course from the first time, this should be very fresh in your mind. If you're coming back, maybe it's not so fresh. But what we did here in the background view is I passed a binding down to isNight. We don't have to do that in this case. To be honest with you, I'm not sure why I did that here, but this is a good learning opportunity. Good chance for me to actually show you more of what binding does, because anytime you do something wrong and then you come back and fix it, usually you learn it more that way rather than doing it right the first time, as weird as that is. So we messed this up before because the whole purpose of binding is if in our background view, we're going to change this isNight variable. Maybe if we tapped our background view, we changed it from isNight to true or false. Maybe that was how we changed the background. Then yeah, binding would be good. And we would have to change isNight down here in our background view. But because we're only reading, I guess, if you think about read write, right? We're only just looking at what the value is and then adjusting our background color accordingly. We don't need binding, right? The whole purpose of binding is if we were going to change this variable, because again, it's bound to our initial variable up here on line 12. So if we changed it in our background view and it was marked binding, this would also change. But we're not doing that in our background view. So making it binding, there's no reason to do that. So we'll delete that $sign there as well. So apologies for the confusion. We'll discuss binding more, I believe in the appetizers app we get into it, but apologies for any confusion. Hopefully that cleared it up. Again, only use binding is if whatever view you're passing that value to, for example, it was our background view, you're actually gonna change the isNight variable. Because we're not changing the isNight variable, there's no reason to make it binding. All right, the last thing we're gonna do on this weather app is actually the first new in iOS 15 thing, right? The previous two things were fixing some mistakes, but now this is new in iOS 15, and that has to do with our SF symbols. So before we get into that, let's look at Safari here, and I'll link to this in the description. SF Symbols 3 is the new thing. So you see it added over 600 new symbols, enhanced color customizations, which is the main thing we're gonna discuss here. But check out this link. Here's what we're gonna deal with here, right? This enhanced color customizations. So it got a new hierarchical and palette rendering. So what hierarchical is, I'll keep zooming in here to make this image bigger. I guess the image isn't getting bigger. Funny, I zoomed out and made it bigger. Anyway, hierarchical is this second row. You see how it's kind of like the same color, but there's like layers to it? Like there's like a brighter blue and a dimmer blue. So hierarchical gives it layers, and if you have the same color with hierarchical, it'll look like this, kind of like the monochrome look. Whereas palette gives you full control over these layers. So you can make them all kinds of different crazy color combinations or whatever fits with your app. And that's what we're gonna play around with. So back to Xcode, let's deal with that here. And we'll do that in our main weather status view, right? Where we have our image, which we're passing an image name, which again is the SF symbol that we pass in, which we did up here, right? How we did, wind.snow, sunset.fill, snow, right? So that was just a quick little recap. But we're basically just gonna mess with the modifiers on this image, right? And you can see the little red squares on my preview. Those are the images that we're dealing with here. So we did rendering mode original to get the multicolor. So you don't wanna mess with that anymore. You wanna do symbol rendering mode. And then you're gonna see if you do a dot, you can see the options. So as we just talked about, hierarchical, multicolor, palette. So if we want what we have now, we would do multicolor. Do a Command B, nothing should change because that's what we have. Okay, now let's go hierarchical. And then we have to give it a foreground color. Well, you can see it's black by default, and you can already kind of see the layers. I'm gonna zoom in really close to our SF symbols here, right? You can already see the layers even though they're black. If you wanna change the color, gotta do it after resizable. Do foreground color, let's say .red, and those will change to red, and you can see the depth, right? We got really bright red and then like a 50% opacity red. And real quick, the reason you have to do this after resizable is because the resizable modifier is only on an image. So as soon as we put a foreground color modifier before that, it won't be an image anymore, it'll just be a view, and a view doesn't have resizable. I believe we get into that in a little bit when I talk about modifiers and how you're just building like layers and layers and layers. So that was a little preview. You'll see that in a little bit. Okay, now let's mess with palette, because palette is the pretty cool one, right? So palette here, nothing, well, I guess it did change. Everything's all red. So a palette has 3 colors you can give it. So instead of foreground color, we'll give it foreground style. And then you can see, actually, that's not the initializer I wanted. So I want to do foreground style. And then look, so that was just one color, but you see we got primary, secondary, tertiary. So this will give you 3 colors. And here's how this works, because some of these shapes, I think ours are only gonna have 2, but some of our SF symbols have like 3 layers of palette. So you gotta give it 3 colors. So we're gonna do .mint, .orange, and then green for our third one. So the first 2 colors, right? If your SF symbol only has 1 layer, okay, mint's a bad color. You can barely see that. I guess we'll do pink here. So like I was saying, if your SF symbol only has 1 layer, like our Wednesday sun, that only has 1 layer, so that's gonna give you the first color, which is pink. If your SF symbol has 2 layers, which you can see Tuesday, Thursday, Friday has 2 layers, well, the second layer is going to be orange. So you can see how that works. And then I don't think any of ours have 3 layers. No. But some of the SF symbols do have 3 layers. So that's what this third color will be. So you can see if you have a certain like brand color scheme going on, you can change your SF symbols to have different layers to match that color scheme. So big picture, we're just getting a lot more control over the SF symbols. And again, if you just want more of the same color look, hierarchical, and then you don't do a foreground style, you just do a foreground color, and then we can do .pink, and then that'll give us, again, that kind of pink layered look right there. Hit resume on the preview, just make sure we're good. But that is new in iOS 15, new in SF symbols. Again, SF symbols are constantly growing year over year. They're getting better and better and better. I love them, and just the addition to completely customize the color is a super good one. So that's what's new in iOS 15 in the weather app. Let's move on.